Hello, and welcome to the Angry Ewok channel. Today, I'd like to discuss the Onager. I've gotten a lot of different requests from people on Discord, from people on my channel, asking for how do you beat Onagers? How do you beat Sloan Onagers? And there's a lot of discouragement out there. And I'll be honest with you, I agree that they're too good. I agree that there are some things that they're overtuned pretty badly. But we won't go into that. What I want to do in this video is I want to come at it from a very sterile perspective and say, alright, this is what they do, this is what they typically are built like, and this is, what their capabilities are. And after we discuss their capabilities, I want to go into, okay, well, knowing their capabilities, these are the best ways to attack them. So this video is basically aimed at a factual evaluation of what an Onager can and cannot do, and then a discussion of what typical fleets using Onagers try to do so that we can build into a strategy against them. When you see an Onager, you typically will see something like this. You'll see a test bed with the long-range ignition, and you'll probably see Cataclysm. And the reason for all that is just the test bed is more points efficient. The long-range ignition is, extends that first strike capability out a little bit farther, and Cataclysm gives you the option of shooting on turn 1 if the situation arises. And even if it doesn't, it typically influences deployment enough to pay for itself anyway. So that's pretty standard. And then you'll see the officer slot. Sometimes it gets used for intel officer. More often though, it's some just throwaway officer. It's typically like a Nita or a Titus, or maybe Admiral Tua if you want to put ECM on it. But it's going to be a cheap officer that can be discarded later to fuel the Vader reroll off of a flotilla. The support team typically doesn't get used. Sometimes you'll see auxiliary shield teams, but not typically. And then the big question of how do you build your Onager is how you use your weapons team slots. A lot of times you'll see veteran gunners, and the reason for veteran gunners is because red dice are not very reliable, and they're also not great at rolling accuracies. So veteran gunners is just a carte blanche reroll, which is nice. And then you may see ordnance experts. You also might see weapons teams, sensor teams, and you'll see that here. This is the sensor team build. Again, both of these builds, it's only about 115 points. Now it's still got no officer on it, but you're talking about a ship that's around 120 points that'll hit you from extreme range. Can potentially put 7 dice on target beyond red range with no comfire, no extras, no admirals. So that's what you're facing. Typically somewhere in the fleet you'll see this little guy. It'll be a flotilla with Vader. There might be another one that has Hondo on it. And the reason for that is you might want Hondo Onager. Hondo Onager can get you a token at the beginning of the game, so you can then spend for Cataclysm to put that token out forward. Also, this Vader officer is typically used in a last-ditch effort to kill something. That's why you have those disposable officers on Onagers typically, so that if all else fails, if the dice are just utterly not what you need them to be, you can pick it all up and re-roll it again, to really make sure that the one critical shot of the game that you need to sticks. That's pretty standard. You'll see this Vader shuttle. For demonstration purposes, we're going to put an Onager in the middle of the table at the front of its deployment zone. Then we're going to simulate a Cataclysm shot by placing an ignition token at the extreme front of that range. And then we're going to start discussing where you can safely deploy and not get hit by this shot. So, if the Onager has not been deployed yet, the only way to avoid getting hit with a Cataclysm shot is deploy inside this white box that I've outlined on the bottom. You see this white line running along the long end of this deployment zone. That's basically distance 2. If you're within distance 1 to 2 of your back edge, your whole ship, not part of your ship, your whole ship, they can't get you with an Onager on turn 1 unless they have Admiral Ozzel. If they have Admiral Ozzel as well, all bets are off, because Ozzel lets them do a speed 1 move before the game starts. If they have Ozzel and Cataclysm, they can hit you. There's no way for you to place a ship such that it's not potentially a target if the Onager hasn't been deployed. You basically want to stall out and see the Onager get deployed and deploy around it if you can. But just know that anything that you put down before that Onager goes down, if it does choose to, it can go directly across from that target and use Cataclysm to take a shot. It's probably not going to be a crippling shot unless it's got a lot of else going on, like if it's got Ramadi adding a dice and you've got concentrate fire, because it's going to be a red dice shot. So it's not typically crippling, but just be aware of this, because a lot of people are shocked by the range unless they've seen it drawn out and they don't know how to deploy away from it. Because typically you're going to be dropping flotillas, you're going to be dropping squadrons. The first drops need to go in this band unless there's a very good reason for them not going there, just so that you're not giving away free targets and free information. So typically, when fighting a machine gun nest, when fighting an artillery piece, you want to run around it. You don't want to charge straight at it. There's a problem with this, because this machine gun nest turns very, very well, and it's almost impossible to actually avoid getting hit with it. And just to prove that to you, I'm going to demonstrate here. So we've got an Onager deployed in the middle of the board on the back of its back edge. Typically these things are deployed at speed 1 to 2. If I'm playing an Onager, I'm thinking that you want to be doing a navigate on the first turn to get your guns pointed in the right direction. So at speed 2 with a nav token, with a nav dial, it can do 3 clicks. It's not Judge Rod or anything, just straight up 3. So you'll end up with something like this. Once you do that, it can go right or left. So from the middle of the board, it can project potential ignition angles like this. And then once you start factoring in putting the tokens down and what the range is off of that, you end up with this kind of situation. So there's your 2 potential locations for your ignition, and anywhere in between, as you can adjust your three clicks. So what you end up with is a very, very large area where it can hit you. Pretty much anything inside those white lines is potentially going to get hit by this Onager in the middle of the table. So that is basically to dissuade you from thinking, well, I can just fly around it, because you cannot. You might fly around it if you wait it out. So activations are very important here. But if you go before it does, it's going to be able to hit you, because you see how large of an area we're talking about here. Also, if you are running a speed 2 ship, you're not going to have the speed to be unpredictable enough to avoid getting hit by this. Honestly, my biggest frustration with Onagers is not how good they are, because they are very, very good, but there are ways to mitigate it. My main frustration with Onagers is the effect that they have on the meta and the discouragement of using speed 2 ships. There's a lot of speed 2 ships out there that you really can't legitimately think about taking in a competitive setting because of the Onager, because at speed 2 you're not fast enough to be unpredictable enough to keep it from just consistently putting its best arc on you. So I think that that's the real tragedy of the Onager, is its ability to really neuter speed 2 ships and almost completely remove them from the game as a competitive option, unless there's a very good reason, because of how consistently Onagers can land big 7 dice shots at extreme range on targets that are speed 2. I bring up the graphic, show you all this to basically try to convince you that Onagers you're not going to be able to outfly their potential threat range. They can always potentially hit you. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get them to commit one direction or the other, because after about turn 1 or 2, they're not going to be able to turn and get the guns back on target. So while that graphic that I just showed you looks huge, it looks like, man, this is the whole board. It's not. At any one time, it can only target a small section of that. So don't be quite as discouraged by the graphic as you might be, but just realize there's not a safe spot. You're gonna get hit. What you're trying to limit is how hard you get hit. And again, that's why speed is such a huge deal if you're speed 2, that that black dice, those additional black dice are going to get involved a whole lot more. And they really spike the damage because, 4 red dice, you're expecting 3 damage off of that. You start getting hit with the black dice, you're expecting 3 damage off of reds, 3 damage off of blacks. You're talking about 6 is the expected damage off of, the shot. Doubles the damage by being in black range. So they're twice as effective if they can get that ignition token, at black range of you. And slow ships have a hard time of avoiding that. So we're going to discuss double Onager now, just because a lot of times you'll see this. You'll see either an Onager and a Star Destroyer. Typically the Star Destroyer is out front, brawling. It's got like local fire controls and coming at you real hard. And then the Onagers behind it chipping away, shooting through the Star Destroyer. Often you'll see a lot of Armada fleets do this. Or you'll see double Onager. Really trying to double down on the long range firepower. Typically double Onager looks something like this. It'll either deploy in the middle if it's first player, or usually come out of the corner if it's second player. But this is 2 Onagers deployed on the back edge, typically speed 2. This is what you should expect. And then when they go, usually 1 Onager will go from speed 2 to 1 and double click and do something like this. The other one will go from 1 to 3, adding a click at the first joint and end up here. Very typical to see something like this. And so now you see the 2 ignitions, arcs, and the tokens. And so you see this white line and this white arc. That's pretty much the kill box that's been created here. And if this red circle is being used to represent a ship. A ship in that area would be taking 2 shots at long range at a minimum. And that's where the power of this comes from, because the first shot of 3 to 4 red dice is not going to do a whole lot. A couple red dice should do 3 to 5 damage, somewhere in there, and you might brace it, you might redirect it, you might evade it. The second shot typically is not going to have a lot of available defensive tokens to spend on it. That's where the power of this type of fleet comes from. That second shot is going to overwork those tokens, and you're going to end up taking that shot a lot more cleanly. And that's where the attrition comes in. And so the big way to diffuse this fleet, I think, is to, again, and I keep coming back to speed, have the speed to, even if they do get 1 shot on you, you can move somehow and get to where that second shot will not land on you. So you can very safely spend all your relevant tokens, mitigate the 1 shot as much as you can, and then move away to a safe location. Because you cannot afford to be throwing out your brace token on turn 2. Pretty much in my Armada experience, if you don't have a brace token starting on turn 2, you're not going to survive the game. Unless there's a very, very good reason for it. Typically, this is the kind of fleet you'll see. You'll end up, once all the points are allocated and fleets written, you end up with something like this. Double Onager, typically 2 flotillas. One of them's going to have Hondo, one of them's going to have Vader. And the reason for that is so that one of them can fuel Cataclysm and one of them can fuel the rerolls. You'll have some expendable officer on the Onagers. Then you'll probably deploy them in the middle because they're kind of slow. You don't know where they need to go, but you'll have some combination of usually Merrick Steel Jindin, because they're just too good, too effective for what the points you pay for them. We all know that they're taken in every single Imperial list for a reason. And then you'll have fire sprays typically, or decimators. And the logic here is these 2 artillery pieces are good at softening up and damaging targets, but sometimes those targets get away. And so in order to prevent points from flying away from them, they take squadrons, which are much more flexible, and allow them to rotate over and finish off wounded CR-90s, finish off wounded Chargers or Hammerheads. And it discourages people coming straight at this fleet, which is what you really want to do. You want to rush the machine gun nest. You don't want to sit there and get shot at by it. But when you do, you're running into these fire sprays, and it becomes much easier for these flotillas to command the squads, and they eat you up and finish you. The Onagers soften you up. This chip damage from squadrons finishes. And so like you'll see, it's the same kind of turning in one direction or the other. and then you put the ignition tokens down, and it creates a nasty kill box right there. If you were to leave the kill box, you probably have been hit with enough chip shots and different ignition, attacks that you're not in a good way. And if you, and then the squadron is trying to finish you off, which is typically what we end up seeing. So I'm not going to go into particular tactics of how to counter this today. I wanted to do this video as an introduction and an explanation and understanding of what you will typically see and what their strengths are, and then we'll come back with a video of some of my observations and ways to try to counter it in the next video, but that would be a lot of video to try to make at one time. Some big takeaways. These fleets gain power from being able to hit with all their dice. Being able to put that black ignition range on you is a big deal. They double in offensive output if they can do that. So fast moving ships that can get away from that arc or make that arc harder to deliver are strong. Obviously evades are strong. I think particularly ships that have both a brace token and an evade token are ideally suited to try to combat this kind of stuff. The assault frigate is one of the better platforms for this. With the prevalence of sensor teams, you're probably going to need ECM as well, some kind of way to get around that auto accuracy generation, but either between just rolling it, spending accuracies off the vet gunner and re-rolling, or sensor teaming for an accuracy. Those kinds of ships are going to almost always, they're going to get an accuracy when they fire. It's just a question of how much damage is behind it. So the brace token or the evade token, the most relevant token, will be locked out. So you're going to have I think ECM is the answer here, or thermals, but one of those defensive retrofits is needed to mitigate that shot. And then you need to have the speed to escape the second shot, because you don't want to blow your tokens and then get hit again with a bunch of red tokens, because all your defensive tech goes away if you don't have the tokens to apply them to. Typically what the Onager player is trying to do, he's trying to get a second source of damage on you. That may come in the form of the Onager, another Onager, but it may come in the form of squadrons. A lot of times Steel, Jendon, and some others will fly out and engage to be that second source of damage. Much more flexible, can change locations much more easily to adapt to ships getting away from you. So that's something you want to look at. Also, there's a lot of times there's a Star Destroyer instead of an Onager. It's bomb rushing you, both protecting the Onager and providing that second source of damage. So that's the typical rhythm that you're going to see. We're going to break that down in the next video, so be looking for that. Something to consider is that a lot of times Onagers, once they've taken their first couple shots, turn 1, 2, and 3, if you're flying aggressively and flanking them, they're going to give up on trying to get their guns back around on you. They're going to say, okay, well, I've taken my shots, done my damage, my side arcs are pretty bad, I'm not really going to be able to get a shot there. And a lot of times what will start happening is they'll start getting fed tokens, ComsNet tokens from these flotillas, or nav dials will start coming in, and they'll go from 1 or 2 to 3, and they'll get straight and run away from you. So that's the other big issue with this fleet, is it wants to hit, and then step on the gas and leave, because they're preserving points. That's what you should be doing with the fleet of that nature, but just expect that. Worst thing that can happen to you when fighting Onagers is you go in, you damage one, and then it steps on the gas pedal and leaves, and those points go sailing away, because that's a recipe for a big loss. That's a recipe for, I didn't actually kill anything, and they are invariably going to kill something, because they're shooting long range with a big, casting a very broad net. It's super hard to not give up points against an Onager fleet, just because of how much threat window they have. So just expect that and try to do what you can to counter it. Sometimes it's worth putting a ship that's wounded in their way to bump them, or to be in their way to draw the ignition shot onto a wounded ship that's probably not going to make it out anyway, to try to discourage the shot onto your important piece. There's a lot of value in small ships that can last through one Onager shot and force it to shoot a second time at that same ship to kill it, because then you're taking a 120-point ship and diverting its attention for 2 rounds, especially if you can not get shot on 1, get shot on 2, die on 3. Well, that's half the game to kill. If it's a CR90 or something like that, you're killing 50 points with 120 points. That's not a terrible trade. But you have to have something else figured out to kill the Onager to hurt it otherwise. Thank you for watching. Hope you come back, and hope you learned something.